Story 2, The Flickering Lights of Room 13. I remember pulling into the parking lot of the Blue Ridge Motel late that night, the road behind me slick with rain, my tires splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the dim, inconsistent glow of the motel's blinking neon sign. I was exhausted from hours behind the wheel, eager for a warm bed and the chance to rest before continuing the long drive home. The place looked deserted, almost abandoned. The asphalt cracked and uneven, weeds pushing up through the edges like fingers reaching for the fading light. The neon buzzed intermittently, casting uneven streaks of red and blue across the front facade. I had a strange sense of isolation. The kind that presses down on you quietly until you realize the world has narrowed to a single point, the space immediately around you. At the office door, a thin man with sharp, watchful eyes emerged. He didn't smile, didn't even nod, just handed me a key with the faintest twitch in his fingers. I thanked him, trying to make conversation, but he didn't respond. His silence felt deliberate, heavy, like he was measuring me with some internal scale I couldn't see. The air smelled of damp wood and old carpet, and even inside the office it had that faint metallic tang of rusting pipes. I slid the key into my pocket and made my way down the hallway, the fluorescent lights above buzzing and flickering in a rhythm that seemed almost intentional. The hum of electricity was louder in the quiet, a steady, grating reminder that I was alone. Room 13's door squeaked when I opened it. Inside, the fluorescent bulbs above cast jittering shadows across the walls, making the peeling wallpaper appear alive, crawling toward me in tiny, jagged movements. I dropped my bag on the bed and sat for a moment, staring at the corners of the room. One in particular seemed unnaturally dark, deeper than it should have been, and I could swear it had mass, a weight that pressed against the air itself. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. My brain insisted I was tired, imagining shapes and shadows from the day's drive, from hours of staring at the endless road. But the unease didn't fade. I heard it first as a soft shuffle, almost rhythmic, like someone pacing just behind me. I swung my head around, but the room appeared empty. I stood, moving toward the door and the hallway beyond, expecting relief in the open space. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every time I looked back, the shadows in the corners seemed to lean closer, pressing into the angles of the ceiling and walls. The hum of the fluorescent lights became oppressive, as though the fixtures themselves were straining under the weight of the dark. I tried to unpack, to make myself comfortable, but the sensation grew heavier. The footsteps returned, pacing in that same quiet rhythm, slow and deliberate. I called out, my voice shaking. But there was no reply, only the relentless murmur of the buzzing lights above. I felt a pulse of panic rise, sudden and unwelcome, and I froze, straining to catch any movement. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the lights died completely, plunging the room into darkness so thick it felt like a living thing pressing against my skin. I stumbled, gripping the edge of the bed, my breathing loud in the silent black. My heart thumped so hard I thought it might give me away. When the lights flickered back on, I gasped. The bed looked slept in, the blankets wrinkled as if someone had been lying there moments before. My belongings were in the same place, untouched. Yet the impression of another presence clung to the air, heavy and accusing. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen on the bed, staring at the corner that never seemed to move, but it was long enough for every nerve in my body to hum with tension. I made the decision to leave, to pack my things, and go. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into my bag, every shadow along the walls seeming to ripple toward me with silent intent. I didn't turn off the lights or lock the door. I didn't dare. Every step toward the hallway echoed, hollow, and I half expected the walls themselves to shift, to close in around me. The silence of the corridor was oppressive, punctuated only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the motel. I reached my car and slid into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys, unwilling to glance back. As I pulled out onto the road, headlights cutting through the thick fog of early morning, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Relief was short-lived. Through the rearview mirror, I saw him. A figure, standing by the window of room 13, perfectly still, watching me leave. He didn't wave, didn't move, only observed. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my car skidding slightly over the wet asphalt, the headlights catching the figure just long enough for the memory to embed itself in my mind. It wasn't the typical fear you feel from a shadow or a sudden noise. It was the calm, patient attention of someone who knew you had noticed them, and now they were waiting for you to acknowledge it, to remember it. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the memory. Sleep became difficult, the hum of electrical fixtures in my apartment bringing me back to the flickering lights of that room. Every shadow in the corner of my vision seemed elongated, alive with intent. I imagined the footsteps pacing just behind me, silent but relentless. The unease was subtle at first, a prickle on the back of my neck, but it grew into something heavier, something that settled in the pit of my stomach, pressing on my chest as though the memory itself had weight. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was exhaustion, the isolation of the long drive, the mind's tendency to conjure shapes and figures from mundane details. I considered that the motel might have been abandoned for years, the flickering lights nothing more than faulty wiring, the pacing footsteps a trick of sound in an empty room. Yet, rationalization felt hollow. I remembered the bed, the indentations that hadn't been there before. I remembered the figure in the window, unmoving and calm. The recollection was vivid, as if I had relived it in the waking world, not merely remembered it. Driving past that stretch of the Blue Ridge since then, I cannot ignore the way the road narrows in my mind. I avoid motels along isolated sections, even in daylight. I replay the experience in fragments, the buzzing lights, the shadows, the footsteps, the figure standing silently in the window. And I feel that same creeping weight pressing on my chest. I imagine room 13 still there, the fluorescent lights flickering, waiting for the next traveler who is too tired, too desperate to question what they are sensing. The air inside must still hum with the same tension, the same invisible presence that made my own pulse hammer in terror. Even now, months later, I sometimes awaken in the middle of the night, convinced I hear the soft pacing of footsteps behind me, a rhythm that makes my heart leap and my mind whirl. The memory of that night is lodged in my body, not just in my mind, and I cannot rid myself of it. It is not a sudden fear, sharp and immediate. It is slow, insidious, a quiet knowledge that someone or something was watching, patient, persistent, and aware. I do not know if the figure still lingers in room 13, and I do not wish to find out, but I know, in a way I cannot explain, that the motel, the room, the lights, and that figure exist in some corner of the world, waiting for someone to arrive, just as I did, long after the night I fled. I cannot drive past that road now without imagining the flickering neon reflected in the rain, the cracked asphalt, and the silent figure waiting by the window. I do not know why I remember it so vividly or why it has refused to leave my thoughts. The terror was not loud, not violent, not cinematic in the way movies or stories portray horror. It was quiet, methodical, real. It entered slowly, embedded itself in the smallest details, the flicker of lights, the uneven shadows, the soft, unaccountable sound of footsteps pacing behind me, and it stayed, leaving me forever aware that some corners of the world, some rooms in old motels, contain more than just walls and beds. They contain patience. They contain attention. They contain memory, waiting, and the quiet insistence of being seen. Story 3. The Locked Door at Mountain Haven. I was driving late through the Blue Ridge, the headlights cutting narrow swaths through the fog that hung low over the road. The mountains loomed like dark silhouettes on either side, their slopes thick with pine and shadow. I had been on the road for hours, chasing the faint promise of home, each mile dragging longer than the last. My eyes burned from the strain, and my arms ached from gripping the wheel too tightly. That's when I saw it, the neon glow of the Mountain Haven Motel, flickering weakly against the darkness. It looked ordinary, almost too ordinary, like a relic of another time. The wet asphalt reflected the pale red and blue light, and I felt a strange relief at the thought of a bed. A warm shower, a chance to close my eyes for a few hours. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, and the clerk, a wiry man with hollow eyes, handed me a key without a word. His fingers trembled slightly as he pressed it into my palm, but he didn't acknowledge my presence beyond that. I tried to ask a question about breakfast or checkout times, but he simply returned to staring at the dull television behind the counter, the screen flickering images I couldn't make out. The hallways to the rooms smelled of damp carpet and old wood, the fluorescent lights buzzing intermittently, giving the corridor an unsteady, jittering glow. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, and I felt like my presence was being measured, weighed, accounted for. When I opened my assigned room, the space seemed normal enough, if tired and unremarkable. But at the far end of the corridor inside the room, I noticed a door I hadn't seen on the layout posted in the office. It was heavy, wooden, with a rusted lock set deep into its frame. I instinctively reached for a key, but it had vanished from the key ring entirely, as though it had never existed. A shiver crawled up my spine, the first real unease of the night settling in like a cold hand on my shoulder. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was a storage closet, a maintenance room. But something about the door felt wrong, charged, alive with waiting. That night, I lay in bed, hoping exhaustion would drown the sense of dread. But the silence was deceptive. Faint scratching began, soft at first, almost tentative, like nails raking across wood. It grew deliberate, measured, accompanied by low groans that seemed to echo from behind that locked door. My pulse quickened, and I tried to tell myself it was rats, or the building settling, but the rhythm of the sounds was too human, too deliberate. I could feel them, pressing against the door, listening, aware of me on the other side. The scratching became scratching and tapping, desperate, urgent, pleading in a way I couldn't understand. Sleep was impossible. Every time I drifted, the groaning rose in pitch, louder, insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves vibrated with it. I sat on the edge of the bed, knees drawn to my chest, straining to catch any detail in the shadows of the room. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, a shift in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just the door, silent again for a moment, only to begin the noise anew. Hours passed like this, thick and suffocating, the sound and the darkness blending into something that pressed on my mind and chest. At dawn, the first pale light filtering through the blinds, I couldn't stay another second. I stumbled into the hallway, moving as quietly as I could, desperate to reach the office and leave. The corridor seemed altered somehow, longer, tighter, the air heavier, as though the motel itself had expanded overnight to contain me. But when I reached the office, it was empty. No clerk, no keys, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Panic surged through me, but instinct took over. I ran back down the hallway toward my room, every shadow stretching unnaturally in the morning light. When I looked at the door, my stomach dropped. It was wide open, the lock swinging uselessly in the frame. The room beyond was empty. There was no one there. And yet, the air carried a scent that made my throat tighten, thick and metallic, like iron mixed with rot. My skin prickled, and I had the unmistakable nauseating sensation that I had never truly been alone, that something, or someone, had been there, hidden just out of reach, waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, to turn my back and never look again, but the weight of that air, that smell, made it impossible to act quickly. I fled, leaving the door open, leaving the room exactly as it was, not daring to glance back until I had reached my car. Even then, the sense of presence clung to me, lingering at the edges of perception, a subtle pressure in the air that followed me as I drove down the winding mountain roads. The memory of those sounds, the rhythm of the scratching, the low, pleading groans, stayed with me, embedded in my chest, a pulse that refused to calm. Weeks later, I could still recall every detail. The flickering fluorescent lights, the long corridor, the rusted lock of the mysterious door. The memory wasn't sharp in the way photographs capture images. It was sharp in the body, in the nerves, in the way my pulse quickened at the thought. Every time I hear faint noises in the night, creaks or taps that might be the house settling, my mind races back to that room. I see the door, impossibly solid yet hollow, and I can almost hear the rhythmic scratching, the desperate low groans that once pressed against it, filling the space with life, or something close to it. I don't tell people about it. There's no point. No one would understand. They'd call it fatigue, imagination, the product of driving too long through fogged mountain roads. But I know what I heard, what I felt. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can sense that rhythm again in the corner of my vision, a quiet insistence, a waiting that I cannot ignore. The motel, the door, the presence, it exists somewhere out there, patient, deliberate, and aware, and I know that Room 13's twin at Mountain Haven will continue to wait for the next traveler who arrives, exhausted and unaware, drawn in by neon light and the promise of rest, unprepared for the persistent, deliberate, living quiet that has always been there. Even now, long after the drive, long after I convinced myself I had left it behind, I feel it, small, subtle, pressing against the back of my mind. The scratching echoes faintly in the hush of my apartment at night. The low groan of something desperate and unseen pressing against boundaries that shouldn't exist. I can close my eyes and see the hallway, the lock, the empty room, the oppressive smell that fills the space even when no one is there. I can feel it in my chest, a pulse of tension and dread that never fully fades. A reminder that some doors in the world should never be opened, and some presences never truly leave. I haven't returned to that part of the Blue Ridge. I avoid the roads where Mountain Haven sits, neon flickering, wet asphalt reflecting its light, cracked and uneven, as if waiting for another weary traveler. The memory stays with me, lodged deep inside, a weight I cannot shrug off. I think about the door and what might have been behind it, the careful, deliberate sounds that pressed against the thin wood, the low, pleading groans that seemed to echo in my very chest. I try not to imagine what or who was waiting, but the image lingers anyway, sharp and persistent. The motel and that locked door out there somewhere, patient and silent, a quiet testament to waiting, to presence, to the inevitability that some places remember everyone who comes inside. Story 4. The Figure in the Parking Lot. I had been driving through the Blue Ridge for hours, the headlights slicing through the dense night fog, my body stiff from holding the wheel too long. The road had been empty for miles, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My eyes were heavy, and I was desperate to find a place to rest before the exhaustion finally caught up with me. That's when I saw it. The flickering neon sign of the Blue Ridge Motel, casting uneven red and blue shadows across the slick asphalt. Relief hit me first, a quiet, almost physical weight lifting from my shoulders at the thought of a bed, a shower, and a few hours of sleep. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a figure standing beneath one of the flickering lampposts. At first, I told myself it was just someone wandering late, maybe a guest who had been staying nearby or a local passing through. The figure was unmoving, perfectly still, except for the occasional jerk of the head that seemed too deliberate to be casual. I parked the car, engine ticking as it cooled, and that's when the unease began. The figure moved, not quickly, not with urgency, but in a slow, deliberate fashion that mirrored the steps I took toward the office. It seemed to match my pace exactly, though I had not yet left my car. Inside the motel office, the clerk was present but distant, his eyes scanning a ledger rather than meeting mine. I tried to make conversation, but he only nodded once, handing me a key without a word. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old coffee, a mixture that made my stomach tighten in an unexplainable way. I glanced out the window toward the parking lot, and the figure was still there, unmoving again, its shadow stretching long across the asphalt, the light from the flickering lamp catching in odd angles that made its shape seem almost wrong, stretched, elongated. I took the key and made my way to my room, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that exhaustion was warping my perception. The hallway smelled of damp carpet and musty wood. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing in the narrow corridor. My room was ordinary, tired, and unremarkable, but I couldn't stop looking out the window at the parking lot below. The figure remained. Sometimes it seemed closer, sometimes farther, but always present, always unmoving, always watching. I turned away to unpack, trying to focus on mundane things, clothes, toiletries, the small television in the corner. But my mind kept drifting back to that parking lot, to the shadow under the lamppost, to the strange, unblinking stillness that pressed at the edge of my vision. Night fell fully, and the motel grew quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights above my head, the only sound, apart from the occasional groan of the old building settling. I tried to sleep, telling myself I had imagined it, that it would be gone when I woke. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could picture the figure standing in the lot, shadow stretching unnaturally across the asphalt, watching, waiting. Occasionally I would dare a glance out the window, and it would be there, always at the edge of the light, silent, a presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It never moved quickly. It didn't speak. It didn't blink. But its deliberate, patient pacing as I had driven into the lot earlier replayed in my mind like a slow, methodical drumbeat. Hours passed in a blur of fatigue and quiet panic. I stayed seated by the window, hands gripping the edges of the sill, heart hammering, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a local with some strange habit, a person waiting for a friend, a figure out of place and misperceived in the low light. But rational thoughts didn't erase the feeling of being watched, didn't remove the sense that the figure was connected to me personally, that it had been tracking me, studying me, waiting. I felt exposed, vulnerable in the room that should have been a sanctuary from the night. Every shadow in the parking lot seemed alive, bending around the figure in ways that the lamp above shouldn't allow. Eventually, dawn began to break, the sky pale and cold, washing the parking lot in weak, grey light. I was still awake, still watching, still tense. The figure had not moved from its place under the flickering lamp. Still there, still patient. I packed my things quickly, trying to convince myself to leave, to escape whatever quiet, unmoving menace had attached itself to my presence. I slipped out of the room, moving down the hallway, and glanced back through the window once more. The figure remained, unmoving, shadow stretching, unblinking, like it was etched into the asphalt itself. I drove away slowly at first, then faster as I descended the winding mountain road. The figure did not move from its place in the parking lot. It did not speak. It did not blink. I could not see a face, could not determine any human feature beyond the basic silhouette, but the memory of its presence was seared into my mind. Every turn of the road, every curve through the dense fog, my thoughts returned to it, and a creeping, cold unease settled in my chest. Even when I was miles away, I could feel its gaze at the edge of my consciousness. Patient, silent, relentless. Weeks later, I could still recall the figure vividly. I could describe the lamppost, the cracked asphalt, the faint hum of the neon sign, the quiet way it had matched my pace as I entered the motel. I replayed it in my mind obsessively, trying to rationalize, trying to ignore the gnawing unease that seemed to cling to me. Night after night, the memory returned unbidden, shadows bending strangely at the corners of my bedroom, faint movements just out of the range of my vision. I would awake suddenly, convinced I had glimpsed it pacing in my apartment, shadow long and unmoving, waiting as it had that night. I have avoided that stretch of the Blue Ridge since then. I refuse to pass the motel, to see the lamppost in the parking lot, to imagine the figure standing there, patient and deliberate. Yet, I cannot rid myself of the memory. It is embedded in my nerves, in the way my pulse quickens when I am alone in the dark, in the way every shadow in the corner of my vision seems to stretch unnaturally. The presence of that figure, silent and unblinking, lingers in my mind, a reminder that some things exist just out of reach, waiting quietly, deliberately, and that I was never truly alone, even in a room that should have offered refuge. Even now, when I drive at night through quiet stretches of road, I feel it. The sense of being watched, the patient, deliberate attention of a presence that has no need for movement, words, or recognition beyond awareness itself. It is not a sharp terror, sudden and violent, but a creeping, unshakable dread, a feeling that some quiet observers exist in the world, in the edges of light, in the spaces we consider safe. I cannot explain it. I do not know why it chose me, or why it remained so steadfastly in the parking lot that night. But I know it is out there, still standing under that flickering lamppost, waiting for the next traveler, as patient and silent as it was when I first saw it. And I know that I will never forget it, will never truly leave it behind, because the figure, the shadow, the deliberate unblinking presence has burned itself into my mind in a way that will not fade. I can close my eyes and see it still, stretching across the cracked asphalt, waiting, patient, silent. I know that the world will continue on, oblivious, but some nights, in the quiet hours, I am certain that figure is still there, just beyond perception, watching, waiting, and I will never feel truly alone again. Story 5. The Phone That Rang Alone. I pulled off the winding mountain road late that night, headlights cutting through the fog that had settled low in the valleys. The Blue Ridge Mountains were quiet, eerily so. The only sounds the whisper of the wind through the pines and the occasional scuttle of some unseen animal in the underbrush. I had been driving for hours, chasing the last traces of daylight, my muscles stiff and my mind foggy with fatigue. When I saw the neon glow of a small roadside motel tucked between the hills, relief washed over me like a cold splash of water. The sign flickered intermittently, its red letters sputtering against the darkness, but it was enough. I needed a room, some solitude, a place to rest before resuming the drive at first light. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee and mildew, a sour mix that made my stomach tighten, but I ignored it. The clerk was a thin, gaunt man with pale skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. He gave me a slow, calculating look before handing me a key without a word, the tip of his finger brushing mine in a way that made my skin crawl. I nodded and thanked him, but he didn't respond. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a quiet, unsettling stillness, like he was weighing me against some internal measure I could not see. I turned toward the hall leading to my room, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. The carpet damp with the mountain mist that had crept inside the building. Every step I took echoed faintly, the sound oddly hollow in the empty corridor. The room itself was small, simple, and clean enough, with faded wallpaper and a threadbare carpet. A single window faced the parking lot, and the old rotary phone mounted on the wall beside the bedside table caught my attention immediately. I remembered the clerk's words as I dropped my bag on the bed. No calls come in after midnight. The words sounded casual, offhand, but there was a strange weight to them in hindsight, an unspoken warning I did not understand at the time. I unpacked slowly, trying to distract myself from the fatigue gnawing at my limbs. But the silence in the room pressed down like a physical weight. It was just past midnight when the phone rang. The shrill, insistent sound cut through the stillness of the room, jerking me upright in the bed. My first thought was that I had misheard, that fatigue had tricked me into hearing something. But it rang again and again, each time sharp and urgent, impossible to ignore. I grabbed the receiver, hands trembling, and lifted it to my ear. Silence. Then a sound, a low, deliberate breathing, slow and measured, as if someone were just behind me, inhaling and exhaling with careful intention. I froze, listening. It was neither rushed nor frantic, but the precision of it was terrifying. An awareness in the sound that made my own breathing feel too loud, too clumsy, too human. I tried to hang up, desperate to end it, but the line went dead only for a moment before the phone shrilled again, the piercing sound shattering the quiet. Each time I answered, the breathing was there, the same deliberate rhythm, close yet impossible to locate. I moved to the window, peering out into the foggy parking lot, expecting to see someone standing beneath a light, some trick of a human presence that would explain the noise. But the lot was empty, quiet except for the soft whisper of wind through the trees. The unease settled into my chest, heavy and unyielding. Hours passed this way, the ringing recurring in unpredictable intervals, dragging me into a haze of fear and exhaustion. I tried to convince myself it was a malfunction, the building's wiring faulty, or perhaps the wind somehow triggering the line. But rational thoughts offered no comfort. The breathing was too precise, too intentional, too aware of me. Each ring made my heart thump painfully, and I found myself gripping the receiver for long stretches, unable to let go, unable to ignore it. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside the window seemed to echo the same rhythm as the breathing on the line. My imagination twisted and turned, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, no discernible source. Only the phone, ringing. The slow, deliberate presence on the other end, aware of my fear, pressing it into my chest. By dawn, the phone stopped ringing. The silence that followed was almost worse than the ringing itself. Heavy, expectant, as if the room had been holding its breath. I looked at the receiver and the wall where it had been mounted, and my stomach sank. The phone was gone. The cradle was empty, the cord dangling uselessly, as if it had never existed. I searched the room, the hallway, even under the bed, my hands trembling, but it was gone. There was no trace of it, not even the faintest imprint on the wall. I left the motel immediately, still shaken, driving down the fog-laden road with my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement along the roadside, every flicker of light that might hint at a presence just out of reach. The memory of the phone persisted long after I had left the mountains behind. I would hear faint ringing in the wind, subtle and insistent, echoing in my ears at odd times of day. It was never loud enough for anyone else to notice, never continuous. Just a fleeting, precise reminder that the presence I had felt in that room had not been imagined entirely. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, the same deliberate, measured awareness that had followed me through the night, pressing at the edges of perception impossible to shake. Even in my apartment hundreds of miles away, quiet moments became unbearable. The sound of a distant siren, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind rattling the window pane, each carried a hint of the deliberate breathing from that phone, a phantom awareness that had burned itself into my mind. I have avoided that stretch of road ever since, even during the day, even when the fog is thin and the mountains seem friendly. The image of that small, simple motel, the phone mounted on the wall, the deliberate breathing and the ringing that came without reason, has embedded itself into my memory with a clarity that haunts me still. I cannot explain it. I do not know who or what was on the other end, nor do I want to. I only know that the presence existed, patient and attentive, aware of me in a way that left no room for doubt. The simplest sounds now carry a weight I cannot dispel. A rhythm that recalls that night, that phone, that deliberate, impossible awareness. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear it faintly. Just a whisper of a ring carried on the wind, echoing in the hollow spaces of memory. The terror is quiet, slow, persistent, unlike anything I have experienced since. There is no figure to see, no voice to understand, no explanation to grasp. Just the knowledge that something watched, something waited, something knew me in that room in the Blue Ridge, in that small roadside motel, and that its presence did not end when I left. The ringing follows, subtle, almost imperceptible, a reminder that some nights, some moments, some small, ordinary objects hold awareness, patience, and intent. And that night, that phone, and that deliberate breathing presence will never leave me, nor will it ever allow me to forget the quiet dread that is so easily dismissed, yet impossible to escape. Story 6. Shadows in the hallway. I had been driving through the Blue Ridge Mountains for hours, the darkened curves of the road swallowing the headlights as the fog crept low across the pavement. The air smelled of damp pine and earth, heavy and almost suffocating. I had been awake too long, fatigue gnawing at my mind and limbs, and when I saw the dim neon glow of the Blue Ridge Inn tucked between two slopes, a strange relief settled over me. The parking lot was mostly empty, cracked asphalt glistening from an earlier rain, and a single flickering light above the entrance cast shadows that danced across the walls like a silent warning. I pulled in slowly, telling myself I only wanted a bed for the night, some semblance of rest before continuing the drive at dawn. Inside, the office smelled faintly of old carpet and disinfectant, the kind of antiseptic that hides something older and fouler beneath it. The clerk, a thin man with pale, tired eyes, handed me a key without a word. His gaze lingered too long, like he was measuring my presence, weighing me against some unseen standard, and I felt an inexplicable chill creep along my spine. I murmured a polite thanks and walked down the hall, each step echoing unnaturally in the narrow corridor. The lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a dim, inconsistent glow that made the hallway stretch longer than it should have. Each doorway held a pool of shadow that seemed deeper, almost alive, curling in ways that made my stomach tighten. My room was small, simple, with faded wallpaper and a bed covered in a thin quilt. I set my bag down and tried to shake the feeling of unease pressing in from the corridor, telling myself the shadows were just tricks of the light, the hallway, a long and tired building that distorted perception. But even as I sat in the bed, I couldn't ignore the low hum of anxiety crawling up my chest, a weight that pressed against my ribs like the fog outside, pressing against the glass. I tried to unpack quickly, distractedly, wanting only to wash off the road and crawl into the shallow sanctuary of sleep. It must have been just after midnight when I first heard the shuffling. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door, pacing back and forth with a heavy, measured rhythm. I froze, trying to convince myself it was another guest. Returning from a late-night errand, moving carefully on creaky floorboards. But the sound persisted, slow and patient, impossible to ignore, pressing at the edges of my awareness. I pressed my ear to the door, but even though I heard every scrape and creak, I could see nothing through the peephole. The hallway beyond remained empty, dimly lit, and silent, or so it appeared. Then I noticed the shadows. They seemed to move independently of the light, curling and stretching along the walls in ways that defied reason. A shadow would pool at one corner of the hallway, then shift slightly when I blinked, as if observing me, reacting to my presence. My chest tightened, a cold knot forming deep in my stomach, and I felt the first sharp spike of fear that comes not from sound or sight, but from something just beyond understanding, something that refuses to be rationalized. The shuffling continued, measured, deliberate, and the longer I listened, the more I felt it was aware of me specifically, circling my room, marking the rhythm of its presence against the wooden floor. I hesitated at the door, trying to convince myself to confront it, to step out and see what, if anything, was there. My hand hovered over the knob, cold and clammy, the metal slick under my touch. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the floorboards groaned under weight that shouldn't have been there. Each step echoed unnaturally, bouncing back at me in a way that made my pulse spike. The shadows stretched toward me, twisting along the walls, long, curling shapes that seemed to pulse with awareness, as if the dim light itself were alive and watching. My rational mind screamed that it was just the building settling, the light flickering, my nerves fraying after hours on the road, but my body didn't believe it. Every hair on my arms and neck stood upright. The shuffling continued in a slow, deliberate circle back and forth past the rooms, and I realized I was not imagining the sound at all. I tried to move quickly back to my room, but each step felt weighted, as though something unseen pressed against my legs, a resistance I could not account for. The door seemed impossibly far, and the shadowed walls appeared to stretch further, elongating the hallway beyond reason. My panic rose in my throat, a hot, tight knot of fear that threatened to choke me. I reached the door, yanked it closed, and pressed my body against it, trying to hold back the sense of intrusion, of something waiting on the other side, patient and deliberate. I locked the door and backed away, sitting on the bed with knees drawn to my chest, trying to calm my racing heart. Every creak in the hallway, every slight shift in the dim light, set me on edge. I stayed that way for hours, listening, straining for any sound, unwilling to sleep. The inn, once an ordinary roadside stop, had become an enclosed world of waiting shadows, of movement just beyond my perception, of deliberate pacing and unblinking awareness that I could neither see nor escape. The first light of dawn was a relief only in the sense that it promised visibility, a chance to escape the long, impossible night. When morning finally came, the hallway seemed different, somehow ordinary again, the shadows pooling normally and the floorboards silent. I left my room slowly, eyes darting to each corner, half expecting the shapes to resume their deliberate pacing. But the corridor was quiet, empty, sun spilling through the thin windows, washing the walls in pale gold. I gathered my things quickly, paid the clerk with a hand that shook just slightly, and left the Blue Ridge Inn behind, feeling the cold, lingering pressure of something unseen pressing at my back even as I drove away. For weeks afterward, the memory of that night stayed with me. Every hallway I passed seemed longer, shadows too deep and curling in ways that unsettled me. Floorboards groaned under weight that wasn't there, and sometimes, in the stillness of my apartment, I could swear I heard the slow, deliberate shuffling echoing faintly, just at the edge of perception. It was never threatening in a conventional sense, never loud or violent, but it was insistent, patient, and aware, a quiet reminder that some presences cannot be rationalized or explained away. I have avoided motels along that stretch of the Blue Ridge ever since. Even in the daylight, the hills, the trees, the mist, all bring back a faint, unshakable memory of the shadows that moved independently, of the deliberate pacing outside my door, of the way the hallway stretched impossibly under the dim lights. I don't know who or what made those sounds that night, whether it was human, animal, or something else entirely. I only know that it observed, it waited, and it marked me in a way that will never fade. Sometimes, when I am alone in my own home, I feel the presence again. Shadows stretch a little too long across the walls, floorboards groan under weight that shouldn't exist, and a slow, deliberate rhythm presses at the edges of my perception. I can't explain it. I don't want to. I only know that night at the Blue Ridge Inn changed the way I move through space, the way I perceive stillness and shadow, the way I listen to the quiet. Some things once felt never leave. Story 7. The Smell of Smoke in Room 9. I had been driving through the Blue Ridge late that evening, the road slick from a light rain that had started hours earlier, clinging to the asphalt in dark, shiny patches. My body ached from sitting behind the wheel too long, muscles tight and head heavy with fatigue. When I spotted the flickering neon of the Cedar Ridge Motel, relief hit me hard, a strange surge of hope that maybe I could finally rest, if only for a few hours. The parking lot was empty except for a single truck idling near the far end, the engine rumbling softly in the damp night air. I pulled in slowly, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders, telling myself it was just the drive, nothing more. Inside, the office smelled faintly of mildew and disinfectant, a sharp, chemical scent that made my throat dry. The clerk, a thin man with a hollow, worn face, handed me a key without a word. His eyes were pale and tired, but there was something else there, an edge of attention that made me uneasy, like he was noticing details I didn't want noticed. I nodded and muttered a thanks, moving quickly toward the hallway. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, buzzing faintly, the sound harsh in the otherwise quiet building. The walls seemed longer than they should have, the carpet threadbare and damp, and each step I took echoed in the narrow corridor. Room 9 smelled of smoke the moment I opened the door. It was faint at first, a dry, sharp odor that made my eyes water slightly, but there was no fireplace, no ashtray, nothing to explain it. I told myself it was the wiring, the building settling, something mechanical. I dropped my bag on the bed and tried to ignore it, hoping that a shower and a few hours of sleep would push it to the back of my mind. But the smell didn't fade. It grew thicker as the night went on, curling in the corners of the room like a living thing, pressing into my nose and throat, making each breath laborious. I opened the window, hoping to draw fresh mountain air inside, but the smoke didn't disperse. It lingered stubbornly, moving in subtle, curling tendrils, clinging to the edges of furniture, drifting just above the floor as if aware of my presence. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that fatigue was twisting perception, but the weight of it in the room felt real, tangible, pressing at my chest. The scent was intoxicating in its own way, thick and choking, carrying a sharp, acrid hint that made me cough despite my best efforts. At some point, I thought I saw it, tiny tongues of flame licking the ceiling near the far corner of the room. They were faint, flickering just at the edge of vision, and each time I blinked or looked away, they vanished, leaving only the smell of smoke and the quiet hum of the fluorescent light above. I moved closer, my heart hammering, trying to find the source. But the room remained ordinary in its layout, nothing burning, nothing smouldering. My hands shook, and I coughed again, the smoke now so thick that I felt it settle in my lungs, leaving a heavy ache that made my chest tighten. I backed away from the corner, desperate for a rational explanation. The smell pressed at me, unrelenting, curling around my legs, teasing the edges of my vision. The silence in the room was almost unbearable, broken only by my own uneven breathing and the faint hum of the building settling. I felt a weight in the air, a subtle, almost conscious presence that made the hair on my arms rise. The smoke seemed to follow me as I moved, drifting in patterns that were impossible for air currents to account for, pooling near the floor, rising slightly, then retreating as if aware of my gaze. I packed my things quickly, hands trembling, trying to ignore the choking scent that clung to my hair and clothes, the way it seemed to twist in the corners like it had a will of its own. The hallway outside was quiet, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. I didn't stop to look back at room 9, though a part of me wanted to understand what I had just experienced. But fear, sharp and insistent, drove me forward, out into the damp night air. The motel felt alive in a way I could not explain, each step echoing in the empty parking lot, the scent of smoke faint but lingering on my clothing. Even as I drove down the mountain road, the smell remained with me, faint and stubborn. It clung to my clothes, to my hair, carried in my own breath like a memory that refused to fade. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a smoker who had left traces in the carpet, maybe a lingering scent from a nearby fire, but none of it fit. The intensity, the way it moved in the corners of my vision, curling and retreating, made it something else entirely, something deliberate, something aware. Weeks later, the memory of that night remains vivid. I can close my eyes and smell it, the dry, choking tang of smoke curling in a room with no fire, moving as if alive, teasing the edges of perception. Sometimes, when I open a door or step into a motel hallway, the same instinctual dread returns, the same awareness that some spaces can hold a presence beyond explanation. I never stayed at another roadside motel after that, always driving past the neon signs, always wary of the quiet corners, always alert to the faintest scent that might be more than it seems. I don't know if anyone else ever experienced room 9, if the smoke is a trick of the building, or if it was something else entirely. I only know that night changed the way I perceive empty rooms, the way I notice corners, shadows, and the lingering weight of the air around me. The Cedar Ridge Motel is still there, I'm sure, waiting for another traveler, another weary driver to pass through. And room 9 waits too, smelling of smoke, thick and choking, curling in ways that defy explanation, and I will never forget it. Story 8. The Staring Eyes Behind the Curtain. I pulled off the winding Blue Ridge Road well after midnight, my car headlights cutting through a thin veil of fog that clung to the trees like cobwebs. The long drive had left me drained, muscles stiff and mind fuzzy, and when I saw the faint flicker of neon from a roadside motel, a dull relief sank into my chest. The parking lot was mostly empty, a few cracked spaces glistening from earlier rain, and a single lamppost buzzed intermittently, casting a harsh light over the asphalt. I told myself I only needed a room for a few hours, a place to rest before continuing the drive at first light, and I stepped out, shaking the stiffness from my shoulders as the damp air hit me inside the office. The air was stale, tinged with disinfectant and the faint odor of cigarette smoke that seemed to cling to the walls. The clerk was a thin, pale man, his face drawn and hollow under the dim light. He handed me a key without a word, his eyes lingering on mine longer than was comfortable, as though he were measuring me, weighing my presence. I murmured a quick thank you and left, making my way down the narrow hallway. The carpet was threadbare and damp in places, the walls a faded beige with occasional water stains. The fluorescent lights flickered softly above, casting shadows that shifted subtly as I walked. Room 12 was small and tidy, with an unmade bed, a nightstand, and a window overlooking the parking lot. I set my bag down and went to close the curtains, only to find that they were stubborn, catching on the rod in a way that refused to smooth out. I tugged and fidgeted with them, finally managing to shut them entirely. As I leaned back against the bed, catching my breath, something at the corner of my eye drew my attention. A faint movement just behind the fabric. I froze, the sensation of unease curling in my stomach like smoke. At first I told myself it was a trick of the light, my tired eyes playing games. But then I saw them, a pair of eyes, dark and unblinking, staring directly at me from behind the curtain. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every instinct screamed to look away, but some deeper part of me remained rooted, locked in a gaze that felt endless. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, but their presence pressed against my chest, a weight that made the air thick and hard to draw. Minutes stretched into something more like hours. I could feel the pulse in my ears, my heart hammering unevenly against my ribs. I tried to reason, to tell myself that the reflection of a streetlight or a passing car outside could explain it, but my rational thoughts kept slipping away, overridden by the raw, unshakable feeling of being watched. Each time I shifted my weight or tried to close my eyes, the gaze seemed to tighten, focusing, patient and deliberate. Eventually, I summoned the courage to step closer to the window, my hand trembling as I reached for the curtain. My fingers brushed the fabric, hesitant and slow, heart hammering in my throat. When I pulled it back, the window was empty. No eyes, no shadow, nothing at all except the faint reflection of the room behind me in the glass. Relief should have come, but it didn't. The room felt smaller, more suffocating, as if the weight of that gaze had imprinted itself into the walls. My skin prickled, hair standing on end as though the air itself remembered what had been there. I spent the rest of the night in a tense haze, every creak of the building and shift of shadows making me flinch. I didn't sleep. Every time my eyelids drooped, I imagined those unblinking eyes returning, pressed just beyond the curtain, waiting patiently. I kept the lights on, pacing the room in quiet, measured steps, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that fatigue had twisted perception. But the feeling persisted, heavy and insistent, pressing against the edges of my awareness. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the windows, I was exhausted, trembling from a combination of adrenaline and fear. I packed quickly, refusing to look at the curtain again, and left room 12 behind. The clerk was still at the office, his gaze now hollow and unreadable, and I muttered a quick thanks as I grabbed my things. The neon sign flickered in the morning haze as I pulled out onto the mountain road, but even as I drove away, the sensation lingered, an echo of eyes that had watched me. Patient, deliberate, impossible to forget. Weeks later, I could still feel them. Shadows in my apartment seemed to stretch too long, corners of rooms held extra weight, and the faintest glint of light in the evening would make my heart jump. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. Some presences are not meant to be understood, only remembered, and the memory of those unblinking eyes behind the curtain followed me like a shadow of its own. Even in well-lit, crowded spaces, the sensation persisted, an imprint of attention, patient, unyielding, that had marked me in that small, quiet room in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Story 1. The Whispering Room at Pinecrest Motel. I pulled into the Pinecrest Motel just as the rain began to hammer the windshield, each drop bouncing off the hood like tiny, impatient fists. The neon sign sputtered, the letters glowing unevenly in the wet night. Pinecrest Motel. The sea flickering in and out, as if struggling to exist at all. The road had been deserted for miles, the mountains around me swallowed in shadow, and the only light came from that flickering sign and my headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. I'd driven most of the day, chasing some vague notion of getting home before dawn, but fatigue had finally caught up with me, dragging my eyelids down and making the road ahead shimmer in exhaustion-induced hallucinations. I needed a room, any room, and I needed it now. When I parked, the asphalt was slick, reflecting the neon like a distorted, watery mirror. The air was thick, smelling of wet pine and something acrid, gasoline from some roadwork further up the hill, I guessed. The whole place smelled like decay and damp wood, a sort of living mold that clung to your clothes and hair. I grabbed my bag and walked into the office. The clerk barely looked up, a thin man with dark, sunken eyes that didn't so much observe me as scan me, marking me as another weary traveller. He handed me a key with a shrug. "Room 7, he said, voice flat, almost bored. I thanked him, noticing a faint tremor in his hands as he handed over the key. He didn't smile, didn't gesture to the exit, didn't say anything else. I felt the first prickling unease settle in my chest. Subtle at first, like a breeze that chills your skin without warning. The hallway to my room smelled of mildew and old carpet. Each step I took echoed in a hollow rhythm that didn't match the thickness of the walls. Room 7's door was wood, worn and splintered at the edges, the lock rattling faintly when I turned it. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, like the room itself exhaled slowly and steadily around me. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks, that any unease came from a long day of driving and the oppressive rain outside. I set my bag down and walked around the small room, noting the bed, the nightstand, the lamp, and the peeling wallpaper. Everything was mundane, painfully ordinary, except the atmosphere itself seemed thick and watchful. As I sat on the bed, a faint whisper drifted from the far corner. I froze, heart skipping a beat. "Hello," I said softly, but the room remained silent. I told myself it was the wind rattling through the old window frames, maybe the pipes contracting in the cold, but the whispers persisted, soft, low, almost inaudible, repeating my name. It wasn't just my name, it sounded distorted, mocking, as if something were imitating me. I swung my head toward the corner, trying to find the source, but the shadows clung to the edges of the room, shifting slightly but staying just out of reach of the light. My throat went dry, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my neck and back. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket around me, but the whispers grew sharper, more insistent. I could swear they were circling the room, coming from one corner, then another, always just behind me. I kept my eyes open, refusing to sleep, but fatigue clawed at me relentlessly. I leaned against the headboard, listening as the shadows crawled along the walls, stretching in ways that didn't make sense, curling around corners that didn't exist. Hours passed like this, each minute heavier than the last, until the whispers seemed to form words I couldn't quite catch. They weren't angry or threatening. They were observant, patient, waiting. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't sleep as I remembered it, but a liminal state where dream and reality bled together. I saw faces pressed against the walls, mouths opening silently, eyes wide and unblinking. They weren't alive, not really, but they weren't entirely dead either. They watched me, and I could feel their weight, the expectation, the knowledge that they were part of the room, part of the air I breathed. I tried to look away, tried to close my eyes, but their gaze followed me, penetrating, inescapable. I woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, to the room still and empty, or at least it appeared so. On the pillow next to me lay a note, thin and yellowed at the edges. I hadn't seen it when I went to bed. Written in careful, deliberate script were 2 words that made my stomach drop and my hands tremble. Don't leave. I couldn't explain why I obeyed, why I froze in place, staring at that paper. It felt as though the room had noticed, had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the carpet itself was holding me down. The whispering started again, quieter this time, urgent in a way that made my ears ring. I grabbed the note and stuffed it in my pocket, trying to push the fear down. To convince myself it was a prank, a trick, a hallucination from exhaustion and isolation, I left the room just before dawn. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and glistening, mist rising off the asphalt like smoke. I didn't look back, not once. The clerk was gone from the office, the lobby empty, as if the entire motel had exhaled and returned to stillness while I slept. I drove away, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The whispers didn't follow me in any audible way, but I felt them in the corners of my mind, curling around the edges of my thoughts like smoke. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadows, the faces pressed against walls. The careful letters of the note. The fear clung to me, not in a sudden, shocking moment, but as a slow, persistent weight, like a coat of wet wool that I couldn't take off. I replayed the details obsessively, the flicker of the neon sign, the smell of damp pine and gasoline, the clerk's lifeless eyes. I thought about going back, about confronting whatever it was that lingered in room 7, but a part of me knew that if I returned, I wouldn't come back the same. Even now, when I drive through the mountains at night, the memory rises unbidden, the whispering, the air so thick it felt almost sentient, the sense that I had been watched for hours before I even realized it. Sometimes I catch myself imagining the shadows, thinking I see them moving at the edge of my vision, and a chill rolls down my spine. I don't tell anyone about it. I can't. People wouldn't understand. They'd say it was stress or exhaustion or imagination. But I know what I felt, what I heard, and I know that somewhere out there, in the misty, darkened hollows of the Blue Ridge, the Pinecrest Motel still waits, still watching, and that room 7 will always remember me, whispering my name, patient and endless, as the world goes on outside. Even now, long after that night, I sometimes hear it, the whisper, barely audible, almost polite, curling through my thoughts. It isn't angry, it isn't overtly threatening, it's patient, waiting, and I realize with a sinking, shivering certainty that I will always carry that sound with me, no matter how far I drive, no matter how fast I go. It has become part of me, a shadow in my own mind, a weight that doesn't lift. I try to sleep, I try to forget, but I know better. Some things don't leave, some things follow, slow and relentless, whispering through the quiet hours when the world is still and the rain begins again. I've never gone back to that part of the Blue Ridge. I'll drive past it, of course, taking the longer roads, keeping my eyes on the horizon, pretending I never saw the motel glowing in the dark. But the memory is there, lodged deep in my chest, a pulse of dread that flares when I least expect it. And I know that if I ever do return, If I ever foolishly cross that wet asphalt under the flickering sign again, room 7 will be waiting, patient, watching, whispering my name.